What is the greatest advice ever given? Have you ever wondered that? What is the greatest advice ever given? All of us have lived our lives with people readily giving us advice, left, right and centre. You name it, there's an advisor for it. There are mortgage advisors, there are relationship advisors, there are education advisors, there are housing advisors. You name it, there are advisors for it. Actually, advice is big business. But we all know that there is some advice that is good, there is some advice that is bad. There is some advice that comes from professionals, there is some advice that has been laid down through families for generations. All sorts of different pieces of advice. But is there one single piece of advice that is so great that whatever situation you find yourself in, whatever circumstances you might be facing, you have a piece of advice that if you follow it, you are guaranteed to get the right outcome? I have good news for you today. There is such a piece of advice. It truly is the greatest advice ever given. It wasn't advice given by a highly trained professional. It wasn't advice given by somebody who knew all the answers, except they did know this one answer. It's a piece of advice that was given, as so many good pieces of advice are, by a mum. A mum 2,000 years ago, a Jewish mother at a wedding. And that advice is simply this. Remember, this is the greatest advice ever given. Listen carefully and take heed, because if you follow it, you will never go wrong. Whatever he says to you, do it. That is the greatest advice ever given. Why is that the greatest advice ever given? Well, think who the mother is. The mother's name is Mary. The he that she says, whatever he says to you, do it, is her son, Jesus Christ. This advice is given at a wedding. Everything has gone wrong at this wedding. Jewish weddings were lavish affairs. They lasted a long time, and it would be considered a great disgrace if there wasn't enough wine to get through to the end of the celebrations. But this mother, Mary, comes to her son and she says, they've run out of wine. And then she turns to the servants and she says, whatever he says to you, do it. And in John's Gospel, chapter 2, Jesus says this to them. Fill the water pots with water. These are water pots which hold around 20 or 30 gallons of water each. There are 6 of them. And Jesus says, fill the water pots with water. And they filled them to the brim. And he said, draw some out now and take it to the master of the feast. And they took it. When the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine. Jesus has just saved the wedding. He has made sure that everybody is able to celebrate properly. He has made sure that there is no disgrace upon the groom and upon his family. And in actual fact, what Jesus told the servants to do leads to an enhanced reputation of the groom. Because the master of the feast, when he's tasted the wine, he turns to the groom and he says, well, everybody else gets out the good wine first. And when everybody's drunk, then they bring out the cheapo stuff. But you have saved the best until last. This enhances the reputation of the groom and the reputation of the family. Why? Because the servants simply followed that one piece of advice. Whatever he says to you, do it. Throughout the Bible, you will see people who follow this piece of advice. Whatever he says to you, do it. If you go to Luke's Gospel and chapter 17, we see 10 lepers come to Jesus. Luke's Gospel, chapter 17, verse 11. It happened as he went to Jerusalem that he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. Then as he entered a certain village, there met him there 10 men who were lepers, who stood afar off. And they lifted up their voices and said, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. So when he saw them, he said to them, go, show yourselves to the priests. And as they went, they were cleansed. As they did whatever Jesus told them, they received what they were asking him for. They wanted to be cleansed from leprosy. He said, go and show yourself to the priests. And as they went, in obedience to what he said, they were cleansed. On another occasion, there was a man born blind, and Jesus put mud on this man's eyes, and he said, go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated as sent. And it says that the man went. He did what Jesus said. He followed Mary's advice. Whatever he says to you, do it. He followed that instruction from Jesus. And he went to the pool of Siloam and he washed, and he came back seeing. When you do what Jesus says, the miracle power of God is released into your life. It is released into your situation. The miracle power of God, whether it's for healing, whether it's for provision, whether it is for protection, I guarantee you, if you will heed a Jewish mother's advice from 2,000 years ago, whatever he says to you, do it. When you do that, the miracle power of God is released into your life and into your situation. For 2,000 years, people have been following this advice. I cannot think of one person who has followed this mother's advice and regretted it. Because when Jesus says do something and you do it, the miracle power of God is released into your life, into your situation, into your circumstance. But Jesus tells us to do things which make life better for others as well. You might remember the parable of the Good Samaritan. A Jewish man is beaten up, left for dead by muggers on the road to Jericho. And as he's lying there bleeding, a priest, a Jewish priest, passes by on the other side. And then a Levite, somebody else who worked in the temple, comes along and sees him and passes by. But then a Samaritan comes. The Samaritans and the Jews were enemies. They hated each other. They had nothing to do with one another. But this Samaritan comes and he binds up the man's wounds. He pours oil on the wounds. He cleanses him. He cleans him up. And then he gets him somewhere safe. He gets him to an inn. And he says, whatever he needs, he can stay here until he's fully recovered. I will foot the entire bill. I'll come back and make sure everything is covered. He looks after him. This is to illustrate what Jesus was saying about who is our neighbor. And he asks the question to the man that he's been telling the parable to. Who was the neighbor of the man who was by the roadside bleeding? And the man says, well, the one who helped him, the Samaritan. And Jesus says, go and do likewise. Jesus sums this up. If you go to Luke chapter 6 and verse 27, Jesus gives us wonderful instruction. If you follow this instruction, can you see how society is going to be changed? Luke chapter 6 verse 27, Jesus says, I say to you who hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. To him who strikes you on the one cheek, offer the other also. And from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who asks of you, and from him who takes away your goods, do not ask them back. And just as you want men to do to you, you also do to them likewise. But if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back. But love your enemies. Do good and lend, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. For he is kind to the unthankful and evil. Therefore be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful. Do whatever he says to you. Can you see how society would be changed if people simply followed these golden rules that Jesus gives us? Jesus says, come to me, you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. If you're struggling with your emotions, if you're struggling with stress, if you're struggling with burdens that are too much for you to bear, Jesus says, come to me, and I will give you rest. Can you see the sense in simply following this advice, the greatest advice ever given? Whatever he says to you, do it. Jesus says, come to me and I will give you rest. Why would you say no to that? And then Jesus himself sums it up in Luke chapter 6 And with this, we come to a close. Luke chapter 6, verse 47. Jesus says, "Whoever comes to me and hears my sayings and does them, I will show you whom he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently against that house and could not shake it, for it was founded on the rock. But he who heard and did nothing is like a man who built a house on the earth without a foundation, against which the stream beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great." When you do what Jesus says, your house stands, no matter what the storms of life. So take heed to the greatest advice ever given. Whatever he, Jesus, says to you, do it.